My daughter Rebecca looked me straight in the eye and said, "Mom, you're 58. Romance is for people who still have their whole lives ahead of them." She laughed as she said it, that dismissive little chuckle she'd perfected since her divorce. "You should focus on being a grandmother now, not chasing fairy tales." 6 months later, I was dancing in the arms of her ex-husband Michael at a candlelit restaurant in downtown Milwaukee, and for the first time in decades, I felt truly alive. But this story isn't about revenge. It's about discovering that love doesn't have an expiration date, and sometimes the heart finds exactly what it needs in the most unexpected places. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Patricia Coleman, and I've lived in Green Bay, Wisconsin, my entire life. At 58, I was recently widowed after 32 years of marriage to my husband Robert, who passed away from a sudden heart attack the previous spring. The grief had been overwhelming at first, the kind that makes you forget to eat, forget to shower, forget that the world keeps spinning even when yours has stopped completely. Robert and I had met in college at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He was studying engineering, I was majoring in elementary education. We were the classic college sweethearts who married right after graduation, bought a modest ranch house in a quiet neighborhood, and built what everyone called a good life. Robert worked for a paper mill company, steady and reliable work that kept food on the table, and allowed me to stay home when Rebecca was born. For 3 decades, our marriage was comfortable, not passionate, not the stuff of romance novels, but steady and dependable like a well-worn sweater. We had our routines. Robert read the paper every morning with his coffee. I cooked dinner at 5:30 sharp. We watched the evening news together before bed. Weekends meant yard work and grocery shopping. Vacations were annual trips to the Wisconsin Dells with Rebecca, and later, when she was older, practical family visits to see Robert's aging parents in Milwaukee. I don't want to paint our marriage as loveless. It wasn't. Robert was a good man, a faithful husband, a devoted father. But somewhere along the way, between mortgage payments and parent-teacher conferences and the daily mechanics of raising a family, the spark we'd once shared had settled into something more like companionship. We loved each other the way you love something familiar and essential, but the butterflies, the late-night conversations, the stolen kisses, those had faded years ago. When Robert died, I mourned not just the man, but the life we'd built together. The house felt impossibly large and quiet. I found myself setting 2 plates at dinner out of habit, making enough coffee for 2 people, reaching for his hand during sad movies only to find empty space. The grief counselor at the local community center told me this was normal, that losing a life partner meant grieving not just the person but the identity you'd shared with them. Rebecca had been wonderful during those first few months. She visited daily, brought groceries, helped me sort through Robert's belongings. She was 29 then, recently divorced herself from Michael after a 5-year marriage that had produced no children but plenty of bitter arguments about everything from money to household chores. She'd moved back to Green Bay after the divorce, taking a job as a dental hygienist at a practice downtown. Rebecca had always been my ambitious child, even as a little girl. She got excellent grades, played 3 sports in high school, graduated from college with honors. She was beautiful too, tall and lean like her father, with thick auburn hair and the kind of confident smile that made people pay attention when she walked into a room. But she'd always been impatient with what she called silly romantic notions. Even as a teenager, Rebecca rolled her eyes at romantic comedies, called Valentine's Day a commercial scam, and frequently announced that marriage was an outdated institution designed to trap women. When she married Michael at 24, I was surprised, not because he wasn't wonderful, but because Rebecca had always seemed so determined to prove she didn't need anyone. Michael had been the opposite of Rebecca in many ways. Where she was intense and driven, he was laid back and thoughtful. He worked as a high school history teacher and coached the varsity basketball team. He had gentle brown eyes, prematurely gray hair that made him look distinguished at 31, and the kind of patient demeanor that made him beloved by his students. I'd always liked Michael, even during the divorce proceedings when Rebecca painted him as unmotivated and content with mediocrity. The truth was, Michael had wanted children and Rebecca didn't, at least not yet. He wanted to buy a house with a yard and maybe a dog. Rebecca wanted to travel, to focus on her career, to keep their options open. Neither of them was wrong, but they wanted fundamentally different things at different timelines. The divorce was civil but sad. Two good people who simply couldn't make their visions of the future align. After Robert's funeral, both Rebecca and Michael had been kind to me. Michael even showed up with a casserole and offered to help with yard work, though Rebecca quickly told him that wasn't necessary. "Mom's got plenty of support," she'd said, her voice carrying that edge it always did when Michael was around. As the months passed and my acute grief began to soften into something more manageable, I started to emerge from the fog. I joined a book club at the library, started taking evening walks around the neighborhood, even signed up for a pottery class at the community college. For the first time in my adult life, I had complete freedom to choose how to spend my time, and it was both terrifying and exhilarating. It was during this period of tentative exploration that I began to notice something I hadn't expected. I missed romance. Not just companionship or partnership, but actual romance. The butterflies, the anticipation, the thrill of getting dressed up for someone special. I missed feeling desired, feeling beautiful, feeling like a woman rather than just a mother and widow. I started paying more attention to my appearance again. I got my hair styled instead of just trimmed, bought a few new outfits that actually fit properly, even started wearing makeup again for everyday activities, instead of saving it for special occasions. I wasn't consciously trying to attract anyone. I was just rediscovering the parts of myself that had been dormant during all those years of comfortable marriage and recent grief. Rebecca noticed the changes immediately, and she didn't approve. She made comments about my new clothes and asked why I was bothering with all that makeup just to go to the grocery store. When I mentioned that I'd enjoyed talking to a widower named Frank at the book club, she quickly changed the subject. When I casually mentioned that the pottery instructor, a divorced man named David, had complimented my work, Rebecca's response was swift and cutting. "Mom, you need to be realistic about where you are in life," she said one afternoon, as we sat in my kitchen sharing coffee. "You're not 25 anymore. You're a grandmother now," though she had no children herself. "And there are certain things that just aren't appropriate anymore." I remember feeling stung by her words, though I tried not to show it. "What do you mean by certain things?" I asked. "Dating, romance, all that teenage stuff," she said with a wave of her hand. "You had your time for that. You were married for 30 years. Some people never even get that much. Now it's time to focus on other things. Your health, your hobbies, being there for family." The conversation continued in that vein, with Rebecca explaining in her matter-of-fact way why pursuing romance at my age would be embarrassing and impractical. She pointed out that most men my age were either already married, recently divorced and damaged, or widowed and set in their ways. She suggested that I was probably just feeling lonely, and that what I really needed was more social activities with other women my age. But even as she spoke, I felt something stirring inside me. Not agreement, but rebellion. Who was Rebecca at 29 and fresh from her own failed marriage to tell me what was and wasn't appropriate for my life? When had my own daughter become the authority on my romantic prospects? That night, after Rebecca left, I stood in front of my bedroom mirror and really looked at myself. Yes, I was 58. Yes, I had gray threading through my brown hair and lines around my eyes. But I was also healthy, financially stable, and for the first time in decades, completely free to make my own choices. I wasn't dead, despite what my daughter seemed to think. And I was about to prove it. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The autumn air was crisp that Saturday morning when I decided to venture beyond my usual routine. Instead of my typical grocery run to the Piggly Wiggly near my house, I drove downtown to the Green Bay Farmers Market. I told myself I was just craving fresh apples and maybe some of that artisanal bread from the German bakery stand, but truthfully I was tired of the same familiar faces and predictable conversations about the weather and how much everything cost these days. The market was bustling with families, college students from UW Green Bay, and what seemed like half the city's population browsing the colorful stalls. I wore a new burgundy sweater I'd bought the week before, something Rebecca had described as too young for me when she spotted it in my closet. The irony wasn't lost on me that her criticism had made me want to wear it even more. I was examining a display of winter squash when I heard a familiar voice behind me asking the vendor about the best way to prepare butternut squash soup. I turned around and there was Michael, Rebecca's ex-husband, looking exactly as I remembered him but somehow different. He was wearing a navy peacoat and jeans, his graying hair slightly tousled by the breeze. When he saw me, his face lit up with genuine surprise and pleasure. "Patricia!" "What a wonderful surprise," he said, giving me the kind of warm hug that had always made him feel more like a son than a son-in-law, even after the divorce. "You look fantastic. How are you doing?" We fell into easy conversation as we browsed the market together. Michael had moved to an apartment in downtown Green Bay after the divorce, he told me, and was enjoying being able to walk to work at East High School, where he taught American history. He seemed different from the somewhat defeated man I'd seen during the final months of his marriage to Rebecca, more relaxed, more confident, more like the person I'd first met 6 years ago. "I've been meaning to call and check on you since," he paused delicately, "since Robert passed. I just wasn't sure if that would be appropriate, given everything." His thoughtfulness touched me. During the divorce proceedings, Rebecca had made it clear that Michael was no longer family, that any contact between him and her relatives would be unwelcome. I'd respected her wishes, though I genuinely missed Michael's presence at family gatherings. He'd always been the one to help with dishes, to ask thoughtful questions about my garden, to remember details about my pottery class or book club. "I would have welcomed a call," I told him honestly. "You were part of our family for 5 years. Divorce papers don't erase that, at least not for me." We spent the next hour wandering through the market together. Michael bought ingredients for what he described as his, quote, weekend cooking experiment. He'd been teaching himself to make more elaborate meals since living alone. I purchased my apples and bread, but also found myself buying things I hadn't planned on. Lavender honey, handmade soap that smelled like vanilla, a small bouquet of late-season sunflowers. "Would you like to grab coffee?" Michael asked as we walked back toward the parking area. "There's a new place called the Daily Grind that just opened. I've been meaning to try it." I hesitated for just a moment, hearing Rebecca's voice in my head warning me about appropriate behavior. But then I looked at Michael's hopeful expression and realized how long it had been since anyone had seemed genuinely excited about spending time with me. "I'd love that," I said. The coffee shop was cozy and bustling, with exposed brick walls and mismatched vintage furniture that gave it a warm, lived-in feeling. We found a small table near the window and ordered a cappuccino for me, black coffee for Michael, and a chocolate croissant we decided to share. "So tell me honestly," Michael said after we'd settled in, "how are you really doing? I know this year has been incredibly difficult." For the first time in months, someone was asking about my emotional well-being rather than just checking items off a duty list. Not, "Are you eating enough?" or "Have you sorted through Robert's papers?" but actually wanting to know about my inner landscape. I found myself opening up more than I'd expected. I told him about the loneliness, but also about the surprising sense of freedom I'd discovered. I talked about my pottery class, where I was creating bowls that were slightly lopsided but deeply satisfying to make. I mentioned the book club, where we'd recently read a novel about a woman who started a new career at 60, and it had made me think about possibilities I'd never considered. "I feel like I'm rediscovering parts of myself that got lost somewhere along the way," I said, surprised by my own honesty. "It's frightening but also exhilarating. Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense," Michael said, his brown eyes serious and attentive. I felt something similar after the divorce. Not that I wanted it to happen, but once it did, I realized I'd been living someone else's version of my life for a while. We talked about Rebecca then, carefully and kindly. Michael spoke about their marriage with the perspective that time and distance can bring, acknowledging both the good parts and the fundamental incompatibilities that had ultimately made them wrong for each other. He didn't blame Rebecca, but he also didn't blame himself in the way I'd seen him do during the worst parts of their breakup. "Rebecca is an amazing woman," he said. "She's brilliant and driven, and she knows exactly what she wants. But she needs someone who wants the same things she does, at the same pace she does. I wanted to slow down, to build something steady and lasting. She wanted to keep moving, keep achieving, keep her options open. Neither of us was wrong, but we weren't right together. His maturity about the situation impressed me. During the divorce, I'd watched Rebecca grow increasingly bitter and critical. Not just about Michael, but about marriage in general, about men, about anyone who seemed content with a quieter life. Michael, by contrast, seemed to have emerged from the experience with his fundamental optimism intact. "What about you?" I asked. "Are you dating anyone?" Michael smiled and shook his head. "I've been focusing on other things. Getting settled in the new place, throwing myself into coaching. We made it to state championships last year. I've been reading a lot, taking some photography classes at the community college. I guess I'm figuring out who I am when I'm not trying to be half of a couple." The conversation flowed easily from topic to topic. We discussed books. It turned out we'd both recently read the same biography of Theodore Roosevelt. We talked about travel dreams. Michael had always wanted to visit Ireland to research his family genealogy, while I confessed I'd never been further west than Minnesota despite living in Wisconsin my entire life. We laughed about the challenges of cooking for one person, and shared stories about kitchen disasters we'd survived. 2 hours passed without either of us noticing. When Michael finally checked his watch, he looked genuinely surprised. "I should probably let you get on with your Saturday," he said, though he didn't move to leave. "This has been lovely," I said, and meant it completely. I can't remember the last time I had such an enjoyable conversation. "Would you?" Michael started, then stopped, looking suddenly uncertain. "Would you maybe like to do this again sometime? Maybe dinner next week?" My heart did something it hadn't done in years. It fluttered. Actually fluttered, like I was 16 instead of 58. But along with the flutter came a stab of anxiety. What would Rebecca think? What would people say? Was this appropriate? Then I looked at Michael's face, at the hope and slight nervousness there, and I realized I didn't care what anyone else thought. This was my life, my choice, my Saturday afternoon that had suddenly become brighter and more interesting than any I'd had in recent memory. "I would like that very much," I said. Michael's smile was radiant. "Friday night? There's a new Italian place on Main Street that's supposed to be excellent." "It's a date," I said, and then blushed at my own words. Michael laughed, a warm, delighted sound. "Yes," he said, "it definitely is." As I drove home that afternoon, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades. Anticipation. Pure, giddy, nervous excitement about seeing someone again. I caught myself smiling in the rearview mirror and realized I looked different. Younger, maybe, or just more alive. I also felt a flicker of apprehension about Rebecca's reaction, but I pushed it aside. I was 58 years old, financially independent, and emotionally free to make my own choices. If my daughter couldn't understand that romance didn't have an expiration date, that was her limitation, not mine. For the first time since Robert's death, I had something to look forward to that was entirely my own. Friday evening couldn't come fast enough, yet when it arrived, I found myself standing in front of my closet in complete panic. I'd tried on 5 different outfits, each one discarded for reasons that seemed to multiply with each passing minute. Too formal, too casual, too obviously trying too hard, not trying hard enough. The black dress made me look like I was going to a funeral. The blue one emphasized every extra pound I'd gained since Robert's death. And the burgundy sweater that had started this whole adventure now seemed completely wrong for an actual dinner date. I finally settled on a deep green dress I'd bought years ago but rarely worn. Robert had always said it brought out my eyes. It was elegant without being flashy, fitted but not tight. And when I paired it with my grandmother's pearl earrings and a touch of the perfume I'd splurged on at the department store earlier that week, I felt like a version of myself I'd almost forgotten existed. Michael arrived at 7 sharp, carrying a small bouquet of white roses mixed with greenery. He was wearing a charcoal gray suit with a navy tie, and he looked handsome in a way that made my stomach flutter nervously. When he handed me the flowers, his fingers brushed mine, and I felt an electric spark that nearly made me drop the bouquet. "You look absolutely beautiful, Patricia," he said, and his voice carried a warmth that told me he meant every word. The restaurant, Villa Romano, was tucked into a converted Victorian house, with soft lighting and intimate tables set with white tablecloths and flickering candles. Michael had made reservations for a corner table that offered both privacy and a view of the restaurant's charming garden, now decorated with string lights that twinkled like stars. We ordered wine, a Chianti that Michael recommended, and I felt sophisticated and feminine in a way I hadn't experienced in years. The conversation picked up exactly where we'd left it at the coffee shop, but with an added undercurrent of romantic possibility that made everything feel heightened and significant. "I have to confess something," Michael said after we'd ordered our entrees. "I've thought about you many times over the past year, wondering how you were doing, wishing I could check in without overstepping boundaries." "What kind of boundaries?" I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. Michael's expression grew careful. Rebecca made it very clear during the divorce that she wanted a complete separation. No shared friends, no family contact, no possibility of confusion about where loyalties lay. I respected that, but it meant losing touch with people I genuinely cared about. Especially you. His honesty was both touching and troubling. I'd known Rebecca had been adamant about cutting ties with Michael, but I hadn't realized how completely she'd tried to isolate him from our family circle. It seemed unnecessarily harsh, though I understood it came from a place of hurt. "Well, you're here now," I said, reaching across the table to touch his hand briefly. "That's what matters." The physical contact sent another jolt through me, and from the way Michael's eyes widened slightly, I could tell he felt it too. We were definitely not just two family friends catching up over dinner. Our meals arrived, osso buco for Michael, seafood risotto for me, and we shared bites while talking about everything from Michael's students to my book club's latest selection. Michael told me funny stories about coaching teenage basketball players, complete with spot-on impressions of their dramatic reactions to his strategy suggestions. I found myself laughing so hard at one point that I had to dab my eyes with my napkin, careful not to smudge my mascara. "I haven't laughed like this in months," I told him truthfully. "Neither have I," he said. "It feels good, doesn't it? To just enjoy someone's company without any agenda or complications." But there were complications, and we both knew it. As the evening progressed, the elephant in the room, our connection to Rebecca, grew larger despite our efforts to ignore it. "Can I ask you something?" I said as we shared a piece of tiramisu for dessert. "Do you think about Rebecca when you're with me? Does this feel strange to you?" Michael considered the question seriously, twirling his fork through the creamy dessert while he thought. "I think about her in the sense that I know this situation is unusual," he said finally. "But when I'm talking to you, when I'm looking at you, I'm not thinking about Rebecca. I'm thinking about how much I enjoy your company, how beautiful you look in that dress, how much I've missed having these kinds of conversations with someone who really listens." His words made my heart race, but they also made me realize how complicated this was becoming. If this continued, and I very much wanted it to continue, we would eventually have to deal with Rebecca's reaction. The thought of that confrontation sent anxiety shooting through my chest. After dinner, Michael walked me to my car in the restaurant's small parking lot. The night air was cool, and when I shivered slightly, he automatically slipped his suit jacket around my shoulders. The gesture was so naturally gallant that it made me feel cherished in a way I'd almost forgotten was possible. "I had a wonderful time tonight," I said as we reached my car. "So did I," Michael replied, stepping closer. "Patricia, I hope this isn't presumptuous, but I'd very much like to see you again." "I'd like that too," I said, surprising myself with how quickly and definitely I answered. "Tomorrow night?" he asked with a slight smile. "There's a jazz quartet playing at the Riverside Ballroom. It might be fun." My immediate instinct was to say yes, but then reality crashed in. "Michael, tomorrow is Saturday. Rebecca usually comes over on Saturday evenings for dinner. She'd see your car, or you leaving, or—" "Ah," Michael said, understanding immediately. "We haven't told her yet." The word "yet" hung in the air between us, loaded with implication. We were already thinking of this as something that would need to be revealed, which meant we were both thinking of it as something that would continue. "What do we tell her?" I asked. Michael was quiet for a moment, then said, "What do you want to tell her?" It was a fair question and one I wasn't prepared to answer. What was this exactly? A dinner between old friends? The beginning of something romantic? A midlife crisis that would burn out in a week? I didn't know, but I knew I wasn't ready to submit it to Rebecca's judgment and inevitable disapproval. I said slowly, I'd like to figure out what this is before we involve anyone else. Is that selfish of me? Not at all, Michael said. It's honest and wise. So tomorrow night, I said, making a decision that felt both thrilling and terrifying. I'll tell Rebecca I'm not feeling well and suggest we postpone our dinner. And then I'll meet you at the Riverside Ballroom. Michael's smile was brilliant. It's a date, he said, echoing my words from the coffee shop. Yes, I said, standing on my tiptoes to kiss his cheek goodnight. It definitely is. As I drove home, Michael's suit jacket still around my shoulders and the scent of his cologne lingering in my hair, I realized I'd just told my first deliberate lie to my daughter. The thought should have made me feel guilty, but instead it made me feel powerful. I was choosing myself, my happiness, my right to romance, over Rebecca's narrow ideas about age-appropriate behavior. And it felt absolutely liberating. The next morning, I called Rebecca and delivered my fabricated excuse about feeling under the weather. She accepted it without question, even offered to bring me soup, which I politely declined. After hanging up, I spent the day preparing for my second date with Michael with the kind of excited anticipation I hadn't felt since I was a teenager. I was lying to my daughter to date her ex-husband, and I was surprised to discover I felt no shame about it whatsoever. If anything, I felt like I was finally waking up after a very long sleep. Over the next 3 weeks, Michael and I fell into a pattern of secret dates that felt both exhilarating and slightly ridiculous. We were two adults, both single, both free to make our own choices, yet we were sneaking around like teenagers afraid of getting caught by disapproving parents. The irony wasn't lost on either of us, but it also added an element of excitement that I hadn't expected. Our second date at the Riverside Ballroom had been magical. The jazz quartet played smooth, sultry numbers, while couples swayed on the small dance floor. When Michael asked me to dance, I hesitated. Robert and I had never been dancers, and I was terrified of making a fool of myself. But Michael was patient and gentle, guiding me through simple steps while whispering encouragement in my ear. By the third song, I'd relaxed enough to actually enjoy the feeling of being held, of moving in sync with another person, of feeling graceful and desired. You're a natural, Michael had murmured, as we swayed to a slow rendition of The Way You Look Tonight. I think you're just a very good teacher, I'd replied. But his compliment had made me feel beautiful in a way I'd almost forgotten was possible. After that, we began meeting twice a week, always carefully scheduled around Rebecca's visits and social activities. We discovered a small bistro in Des Peres, where the chances of running into anyone we knew were minimal. We took afternoon walks through the Bay Beach Wildlife Sanctuary, where the autumn colors provided a stunning backdrop for our deepening conversations. We even drove to Door County one Saturday, when Rebecca was visiting friends in Milwaukee, spending the day browsing art galleries and antique shops like a proper courting couple. Each date revealed new layers to Michael's personality that I'd never fully appreciated during his marriage to Rebecca. Away from the stress and conflict that had characterized his final year with my daughter, he was witty, thoughtful, and surprisingly romantic. He remembered details from our conversations, that I preferred tea to coffee in the afternoons, that I was reading a biography of Eleanor Roosevelt, that I'd mentioned wanting to try Thai food, but never having the opportunity. It was Michael who suggested we take a cooking class together at the community college, Thai cuisine naturally. We enrolled under the pretense that we were both single people looking to expand our culinary skills, which was technically true if incomplete. The class met on Thursday evenings, when Rebecca typically worked late at the dental practice. Cooking together turned out to be surprisingly intimate. There was something sensual about chopping vegetables side by side, sharing tastes of sauces, laughing when Michael added too much chili paste to the curry, and we both spent 5 minutes gasping for water. Our instructor, a cheerful woman named Linda who had lived in Bangkok for several years, paired us as cooking partners, and we developed an easy rhythm that impressed even ourselves. You two work well together, Linda commented one evening, as she watched us coordinate the timing of our pad thai and spring rolls. How long have you been married? The question caught us both off guard. Michael and I exchanged a quick glance, and I felt heat rise in my cheeks. "Oh, we're not married," I said quickly. "We're just friends." Linda looked between us with a knowing smile. "Well, whatever you are, you have a nice chemistry. Cooking together is harder than it looks, but you two make it seem effortless." After class that night, as we walked to our cars carrying containers of leftover Tom Kha Guy, Michael brought up Linda's observation. "She's not wrong, you know," he said, his voice careful but warm. "We do work well together. In a lot of ways." I knew what he was really saying, and my heart began to race. We'd been dancing around the growing feelings between us for weeks, acknowledging the attraction through lingering glances and casual touches, but never directly addressing what was happening between us. "Michael," I said, stopping beside my car, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." "Of course," he said, his expression serious. "Are you dating me because you're genuinely interested in me? Or because I'm a safe way to stay connected to your old life? Because I'm Rebecca's mother, and this feels familiar." The question had been nagging at me for days. As wonderful as our time together had been, I couldn't shake the worry that I was some kind of substitute, a way for Michael to hold on to the family he'd lost when his marriage ended. Michael was quiet for a long moment, considering his answer with the same thoughtfulness he brought to everything else. "Do you want to know what I think about when I see you?" he said finally. "I think about how your laugh is completely different from Rebecca's, warmer, more genuine. I think about how you actually listen when I tell stories about my students, instead of checking your phone or thinking about what you're going to say next. I think about how beautiful you look when you're concentrating on getting a recipe right, and how proud you get when you master something new." He stepped closer, and I could smell his aftershave mixed with the lingering aromas of lemongrass and ginger from our cooking. "I think about how you make me feel like the best version of myself," he continued. "When I'm with you, I'm not the guy who wasn't ambitious enough for his wife, or the teacher who peaked in high school, or the divorced man who couldn't make his marriage work. I'm just Michael, and you make me feel like that's enough." His words took my breath away, literally. I felt tears prick my eyes, not from sadness but from relief and joy, and a dozen other emotions I couldn't name. "Patricia," he said softly, "I'm falling in love with you. Not because of who you used to be to me, but because of who you are right now, in this moment, in this parking lot, looking at me like I just said something that matters." "It does matter," I whispered, "because I'm falling in love with you too." The admission hung in the air between us for a heartbeat, and then Michael was kissing me, gentle and sweet at first, then deeper as I responded. It was my first real kiss since Robert's death, my first passionate kiss in years even before that, and it awakened something in me that I'd thought was gone forever. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathing hard, and I felt like a teenager who'd just had her first real romantic moment. "So what do we do now?" I asked, though I was smiling so widely my cheeks hurt. "Now," Michael said, his own smile radiant, "we figure out how to tell Rebecca." The mention of my daughter's name brought reality crashing back, but for once, the thought of her disapproval didn't fill me with dread. I was in love, genuinely and completely in love, for the first time in decades. I was happy in a way that felt authentic and earned and entirely my own. Rebecca could approve or disapprove, but she couldn't take this away from me. I wouldn't let her. "Not yet," I said, reaching up to touch Michael's face. "Let's have a little more time to just be us before we invite the rest of the world in." Michael nodded, understanding exactly what I meant. We needed to be secure in what we'd found before we subjected it to outside judgment and criticism. But as I drove home that night, my lips still tingling from Michael's kiss and my heart full of possibility, I knew our secret couldn't last much longer. Small towns had eyes everywhere, and we'd been careful but not invisible. The question wasn't whether Rebecca would find out about us. The question was how much stronger our relationship would be when she inevitably did. The unraveling began with a recipe card. It was a Tuesday afternoon in November, and I was at the kitchen counter preparing dinner when Rebecca arrived unexpectedly. She had a key to my house, a practical arrangement we'd maintained since Robert's death, and she often stopped by after work without calling first. Usually this didn't bother me, but lately, her surprise visits had made me increasingly nervous. "Something smells incredible in here," she said, dropping her purse on the counter and peering over my shoulder at the stove. "What are you making?" "Massaman curry," I replied, trying to keep my voice casual as I stirred the fragrant mixture of coconut milk, spices, and beef. "I've been experimenting with Thai cooking." Rebecca raised an eyebrow. "Since when do you cook Thai food? You've never shown any interest in anything more exotic than tacos." I felt heat rise in my cheeks, but I forced a laugh. "I'm trying new things." That pottery class got me thinking about exploring different creative outlets. Cooking seemed like a natural next step. It wasn't entirely a lie. The cooking class with Michael had indeed sparked a genuine interest in Thai cuisine. But Rebecca's suspicious expression told me she wasn't buying my explanation completely. She picked up the recipe card I'd been following, one of several Linda had given us after our last class. Written in Michael's neat handwriting across the top were the words "Patricia's copy. Remember, less fish sauce next time, M." The silence that followed was deafening. I watched Rebecca's face change as she processed what she was seeing, her expression shifting from confusion to recognition to something that looked like horror. "M?" she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "Who is M, Mom?" My mouth went dry. I'd been so careful about hiding evidence of our relationship, but I'd completely forgotten about the recipe cards we'd been sharing. Michael had been helping me perfect several dishes at home, writing notes and suggestions on copies of our class recipes. It's from my cooking instructor," I stammered, but even as the words left my mouth, I knew how weak they sounded. Rebecca flipped the card over and found another note in Michael's handwriting. "Can't wait to try this together next week. Maybe we can add some of those little eggplants we saw at the farmer's market? Love, M." The word love seemed to hang in the air like an accusation. "Mom," Rebecca said, her voice tight with barely controlled emotion, "please tell me this isn't what I think it is." I could have continued lying. I could have invented a story about a cooking friend named Martin or Mark. But looking at my daughter's face, seeing the betrayal and anger already forming there, I realized I was tired of hiding. Michael and I had been careful and secretive for weeks, treating our relationship like something shameful when it was actually the most joyful thing that had happened to me in years. "Rebecca, sit down," I said, turning off the burner and facing her directly. "We need to talk." "Oh my God," she said, sinking into a kitchen chair as if her legs couldn't support her. "It's Michael, isn't it? You're seeing Michael." "Yes," I said simply, "I am." The admission felt both terrifying and liberating. After weeks of carefully orchestrated lies and elaborate scheduling, the truth was finally out. Rebecca stared at me as if I'd just announced I was joining the circus. "How could you do this to me?" she whispered. "How am I doing anything to you?" I asked, genuinely confused by her reaction. "Michael and I are both single adults. We have every right to." "He's my ex-husband," Rebecca exploded, jumping up from the chair. "My ex-husband? Mom, how is that not doing something to me?" "Your divorce was final over a year ago," I pointed out, trying to keep my voice calm. "You've both moved on with your lives." "Moved on?" Rebecca laughed bitterly. "You call dating my mother moving on? This is sick, Mom. This is twisted and inappropriate and gross." Her words stung, but they also ignited something fierce inside me. "Gross?" I repeated. "Two adults finding companionship and happiness together is gross? You're 58 years old!" Rebecca shouted. "You're supposed to be past all this teenage drama." "Past what, exactly?" I shot back, my own voice rising. "Past feeling attractive? Past enjoying someone's company? Past having the right to make my own romantic choices?" Rebecca began pacing my small kitchen like a caged animal. "How long has this been going on? How long have you been lying to me?" "We've been seeing each other for about a month," I said, and I was surprised to realize I felt no shame in the admission. "And I haven't been lying to you so much as protecting something precious from judgment I knew would be unfair and hurtful." "Unfair?" Rebecca whirled around to face me. "You're dating my ex-husband behind my back and you think my judgment is unfair?" "Michael stopped being your husband the day you signed those divorce papers," I said firmly. "He's not your property, Rebecca. He's a free man who can choose to spend time with whomever he wants. And you can choose anyone, Rebecca cried. Anyone in this entire city? And you choose him? The one person guaranteed to hurt me the most? Her words stopped me cold. Hurt you how? You divorced him, Rebecca. You said he wasn't ambitious enough, wasn't driven enough, wasn't the right person for you. You made it very clear you didn't want him in your life. That doesn't mean I want him in yours, she said. And for the first time, her voice cracked with something that sounded like genuine pain rather than just anger. I studied my daughter's face, trying to understand the depth of her reaction. Rebecca, are you still in love with him? No, she said quickly. Too quickly. This isn't about love. This is about respect. This is about loyalty. This is about the fact that my own mother is dating my ex-husband and apparently doesn't see anything wrong with that. I see a good man who makes me happy, I said quietly. I see someone who listens to me, who makes me laugh, who treats me like I'm beautiful and interesting and worth pursuing. I see someone who's brought joy back into my life when I thought I was done with that kind of happiness. And what about what I see? Rebecca demanded. I see my mother making a fool of herself with a man who couldn't even commit to his own wife. I see you throwing away your dignity for some pathetic attempt to recapture your youth. Her words hit like physical blows, but they also crystallized something important for me. This wasn't really about Michael. This was about Rebecca's fundamental belief that I didn't have the right to want more than the quiet, selfless background role she'd assigned me. I'm not trying to recapture my youth, I said, my voice steady despite the tears I could feel threatening. I'm trying to live the rest of my life. And if that makes you uncomfortable, if that threatens some idea you have about who I'm supposed to be now that I'm widowed and past 50, then that's something you need to work through. Because I'm not going to apologize for being happy. Rebecca grabbed her purse and headed for the door, but she turned back before leaving. Choose, she said, her voice cold and final. Him or me? Because I won't be part of a family that includes him. The ultimatum hung in the air long after she'd slammed the door behind her. I stood in my kitchen, surrounded by the lingering aroma of massaman curry and the echo of harsh words, and realized that everything had just changed irrevocably. The secret was out, the battle lines were drawn, and I was going to have to decide what kind of woman I wanted to be for the rest of my life. For the first time since this all began, I wasn't sure what that decision would be. I called Michael immediately after Rebecca left, my hands shaking as I dialed his number. When he answered on the second ring, I could barely form the words to tell him what had happened. She knows, I said simply when he picked up. Rebecca knows about us. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for what felt like an eternity. Finally, Michael's voice came through, careful and measured. How did she find out? I explained about the recipe card, about the confrontation, about the ultimatum Rebecca had delivered before storming out. With each detail, I felt the weight of our situation settling more heavily on my shoulders. Patricia, Michael said when I finished, I'm so sorry. I should have been more careful about. No, I interrupted. We shouldn't have had to be careful. We're adults, Michael. We have the right to see each other without sneaking around like we're doing something wrong. But it feels wrong to her, he said quietly, and I understand why. His words surprised me. You do? Michael sighed deeply. Think about it from Rebecca's perspective. Her ex-husband is now dating her mother. Even though our marriage is over, even though we're both free to see other people, there's something uniquely painful about this particular situation. It probably feels like a double betrayal from both of us. I hadn't expected Michael to take Rebecca's side, and his empathy for her position made me feel suddenly uncertain about everything. So what are you saying? That we should end this? I'm saying we need to think very carefully about what we're willing to sacrifice for this relationship, he said. Because Rebecca just made it clear that there will be sacrifices. That night, I barely slept. I kept replaying the confrontation with Rebecca, hearing the pain in her voice underneath all that anger. I also kept thinking about Michael's words, about the costs of continuing our relationship. Was my happiness worth potentially losing my daughter? Was any romance, no matter how fulfilling, worth that price? By morning, I'd made a decision that felt both necessary and heartbreaking. I called Michael and asked him to meet me at Lambeau Field, in the parking lot where we could talk privately without the risk of running into anyone we knew. It was a gray November morning with the kind of cold wind that cuts right through your jacket, but the weather matched my mood perfectly. Michael arrived looking as tired as I felt, and when he saw my expression, his face fell. "You're going to end this, aren't you?" "I think I have to," I said, the words feeling like they were being torn from my throat. "Michael, I can't lose my daughter. She's all the family I have left." "I know that sounds selfish, but—" "It doesn't sound selfish," he said quietly. "It sounds like a mother protecting her relationship with her child. I respect that, even if it breaks my heart." We stood there in the wind, two people who had found something beautiful together but couldn't figure out how to keep it without destroying other things that mattered. Michael reached for my hand and I let him take it, knowing it might be the last time. "Will you tell me something?" he asked. "These past weeks we've spent together, did they mean anything to you? Were you happy?" Tears were streaming down my face now, and I didn't bother to wipe them away. "They were the happiest I've been in years," I said honestly. "Maybe the happiest I've ever been. You made me feel alive again, Michael. You made me remember who I used to be before I became just a wife and mother." "Then don't let her take that away from you," he said urgently. "Patricia, what we have is real. It's good and honest, and it makes us both better people. Why should we sacrifice that because Rebecca can't accept that her mother deserves to be happy?" His words echoed my own thoughts from the night before, but I couldn't shake the image of Rebecca's face when she discovered our secret. The betrayal in her eyes had been real and deep, and I was her mother. Wasn't protecting my child's emotional well-being supposed to be my first priority? "I need time," I said finally. "I need to think about this without pressure from either of you. Can you give me that?" Michael nodded, though I could see how much the request cost him. "How much time?" "I don't know," I admitted. "Maybe a few weeks? Maybe longer?" He leaned forward and kissed my forehead gently. "Take all the time you need," he said. "But Patricia, remember that you deserve to be happy. Don't forget that while you're thinking." After Michael left, I sat in my car in that empty parking lot and cried harder than I had since Robert's funeral. I was mourning not just the end of my relationship with Michael, but the loss of the woman I'd been becoming with him. The confident, desirable, joyful version of myself felt like she was slipping away, replaced once again by the cautious, self-sacrificing mother who put everyone else's needs before her own. The next few days passed in a blur of awkward phone calls and stilted conversations. Rebecca called twice, but our exchanges were brief and formal. She didn't apologize for her ultimatum, and I didn't tell her about my decision to step back from Michael. I wanted to see if she would soften her position on her own, if she might realize how unfair her demand had been. She didn't. Instead, Rebecca seemed to interpret my silence as agreement with her position. She began stopping by more frequently, bringing groceries and staying for dinner, clearly trying to reestablish our old routine. But something fundamental had shifted between us. Where I used to feel gratitude for her attention, I now felt resentment. Where I used to appreciate her concern for my well-being, I now saw control and manipulation. It was during one of these forced family dinners that I realized how much I'd changed over the past month. Rebecca was telling me about a coworker who was making a fool of herself by dating a man 10 years younger, and I found myself bristling at her judgmental tone. "Maybe she's just happy," I said, cutting into my chicken with more force than necessary. Rebecca looked at me sharply. "Happy? Mom, she's 45 years old chasing after a 35-year-old personal trainer. It's embarrassing." "Why is it embarrassing for a woman to pursue what makes her happy?" I asked. "Why do we always assume that older women who date are desperate or foolish or embarrassing?" "Because there's a difference between being happy and being delusional," Rebecca said. "Some things are just inappropriate at certain ages." Her words were like a slap in the face, a reminder of exactly why she disapproved of my relationship with Michael. In Rebecca's worldview, I had aged out of romance, aged out of passion, aged out of the right to make choices that might be seen as foolish or impractical. "According to who?" I asked, my voice rising. "Who gets to decide what's appropriate for my life?" Rebecca set down her fork and stared at me. "Are we still talking about my coworker?" The question hung between us, loaded with everything we weren't saying directly. This was my chance to tell her about my decision to end things with Michael, to reassure her that I'd chosen her over him, that I'd accepted her vision of who I should be at this stage of my life. Instead, I surprised us both by saying, "No, Rebecca, we're talking about me. We're talking about your belief that I'm too old for romance, too old for passion, too old to make my own choices about my own life. Mom, I'm 58 years old," I continued, my voice gaining strength. "I'm not dead. I'm not invisible. I'm not just a mother and grandmother whose only purpose is to serve other people's needs. I'm a woman, and I have the right to want more than the narrow little box you've tried to put me in." Rebecca's face had gone pale. "So you're choosing him?" "I'm choosing me," I said, standing up from the table. "For the first time in my adult life, I'm choosing what makes me happy instead of what makes everyone else comfortable." As I watched my daughter gather her things and prepare to leave once again, I realized that Michael had been right. What we had was real and good and worth fighting for. And if Rebecca couldn't accept that her mother deserved to be happy, then that was her limitation to work through, not mine to accommodate. The choice, when it finally came, wasn't between Michael and Rebecca at all. It was between the woman I'd been and the woman I was becoming. And I chose myself. The first thing I did after Rebecca left was call Michael. My hands weren't shaking this time. They were steady with newfound resolve. "Can you come over?" I asked when he answered. "I have something important to tell you." "Patricia, you don't have to explain anything," he said gently. "I understand if you need to." "Michael," I interrupted, "I love you. And I'm done pretending that's something to be ashamed of." The silence on his end was different this time. Not heavy with dread, but light with possibility. "I'll be right there," he said. 20 minutes later, I opened my door to find Michael standing on my porch with a bouquet of winter roses and an expression of cautious hope. Without saying a word, I pulled him inside and kissed him with all the passion and certainty I'd been holding back. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless and laughing. "So," he said, his forehead resting against mine, "I take it the conversation with Rebecca went differently than expected?" "It went exactly as it needed to," I said. "She forced me to choose between being her idea of a good mother and being my authentic self. And I chose myself." That evening, we had our first dinner at my house without secrets or anxiety. Michael brought ingredients for osso buco, and we cooked together in my kitchen with the curtains open and the lights on, no longer caring who might see us. We opened a bottle of wine, put on some jazz music, and celebrated our decision to stop hiding. "What happens now?" Michael asked as we sat at my dining room table, sharing the meal we'd prepared together. "Now we live our lives," I said simply. Openly, honestly, without apology. "And Rebecca?" I considered the question carefully. "Rebecca will have to decide if she wants to be part of my life as it actually is, or if she prefers to stay angry about the life she thinks I should be living. I hope she chooses to be part of it, but I won't sacrifice my happiness to make that choice for her." The next few weeks tested that resolve in ways I hadn't anticipated. Rebecca didn't call or visit, and her silence felt like a physical presence in my house. I found myself reaching for the phone to share small moments with her. A funny story from book club, a recipe I thought she'd like, news about her favorite teacher from elementary school who had just retired. But each time, I stopped myself. I'd made my choice, and now I had to live with its consequences. Meanwhile, Michael and I began building something beautiful in the space that honesty had created. We attended the Christmas concert at East High School where Michael taught, and I felt proud sitting in the auditorium as his girlfriend, watching him beam with pride at his students' performances. We went Christmas shopping together, holding hands while browsing the holiday market downtown. We even hosted a small dinner party at my house for some of Michael's colleagues, and I discovered I enjoyed playing hostess to his friends. The most surprising part was how natural it all felt. There was no awkwardness about our age difference. At 5 years, it was barely noticeable. There was no discomfort about being Robert's widow dating another man. Michael understood that I would always love Robert's memory while also being capable of loving someone new. There was simply joy, companionship, and the deep satisfaction of being with someone who truly saw and appreciated me. It was 3 days before Christmas when everything changed. I was at Michael's apartment, helping him wrap presents for his nieces and nephews who lived in Milwaukee, when his phone rang. He glanced at the caller ID and frowned. "It's Rebecca," he said, looking at me questioningly. My heart jumped. "Answer it," I said. Michael put the phone on speaker, and Rebecca's voice filled the small living room. She sounded different, tired and uncertain rather than angry and righteous. "Michael? I was wondering if we could talk. All three of us." Michael and I exchanged glances. "What about?" he asked carefully. "About everything," Rebecca said. "About you and Mom. About what I said. About whether there's a way to fix this mess I've made." An hour later, Rebecca sat in my living room looking smaller and more vulnerable than I'd seen her since she was a child. She'd lost weight in the weeks since our confrontation, and there were dark circles under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and emotional turmoil. "I owe you both an apology," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "What I said about your relationship, the ultimatum I gave, it was wrong. It was selfish and controlling, and I'm ashamed of how I behaved." I wanted to interrupt, to tell her the apology wasn't necessary, but Michael caught my eye and shook his head slightly. Rebecca needed to say this. "I've been talking to a therapist," she continued, "and she helped me understand that my reaction wasn't really about you two being together. It was about other things. Deeper things I hadn't dealt with." "What kind of things?" I asked gently. Rebecca took a shaky breath. "I was jealous," she admitted. "Not because I wanted Michael back. I didn't. I don't. We weren't right for each other, and I knew that even before we divorced. But seeing you two together, seeing how happy you were, it made me realize how unhappy I've been, how lonely, how afraid." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "I've been so focused on building my career, on being independent, on proving I don't need anyone, that I forgot how to actually connect with people. And then I saw you, Mom, at 58, being brave enough to fall in love again, taking risks I've been too scared to take at 29, and I couldn't handle it." Michael leaned forward in his chair. "Rebecca, you don't have to explain." "Yes, I do," she said firmly. "Because what I did was unforgivable. I tried to manipulate you into giving up your happiness because I couldn't face my own unhappiness. I used guilt and family obligation as weapons, and that's not who I want to be." She turned to look directly at me. "Mom, I've watched you this past year, and I've seen you come alive in ways I don't remember from my childhood. You're more confident, more joyful, more yourself. And instead of celebrating that, I tried to tear it down, because it forced me to look at my own life and admit that I'm not as brave as you are." Tears were streaming down my face now, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of relief and love and hope for the possibility of healing. "You are brave, sweetheart," I said. "It takes tremendous courage to admit when you've been wrong, to examine your own motivations, to apologize the way you just did." "Will you forgive me?" Rebecca asked, looking between Michael and me. "There's nothing to forgive," Michael said immediately. "Divorce is complicated, family relationships are complicated, and what Patricia and I did, dating without telling you, wasn't fair to you either." "But the ultimatum was wrong," Rebecca insisted. "You both deserved support, not judgment. You deserved a family that celebrated your happiness, not one that tried to destroy it." I got up from my chair and moved to sit beside Rebecca on the couch, pulling her into a hug that felt like coming home. "I love you," I whispered into her hair. "Nothing will ever change that. But I also love him, and I need you to be okay with that." "I want to be okay with it," Rebecca said, her voice muffled against my shoulder. "I want to be the kind of person who can be happy for other people's happiness, even when it's complicated." "It doesn't have to be complicated," Michael said quietly. "We're all adults. We all care about each other. We can figure out how to make this work if we're all willing to try." Rebecca pulled back from our hug and looked at him seriously. "Are you making my mother happy?" "Every day," Michael said without hesitation. "Are you going to hurt her?" "Not if I can help it," he replied. "I love her, Rebecca. Deeply and completely. I want to take care of her, support her dreams, make her laugh, Grow old with her if she'll let me. Rebecca nodded slowly, then turned back to me. And you, Mom? Are you happy? Happier than I've been in years, I said honestly. He makes me feel beautiful and valued and interesting. He makes me want to try new things, go new places, become the best version of myself. Then that's what matters, Rebecca said, and for the first time in weeks, she smiled. That's all that should ever matter. As we sat together in my living room, three people who had hurt each other and forgiven each other, and chosen love over pride, I realized that this was what family really meant. Not blind loyalty or unquestioning support, but the willingness to grow, to change, to make room for each other's authentic selves. We were going to be okay. All of us. 6 months later, I stood in front of my bedroom mirror, adjusting the neckline of a flowing emerald dress I'd bought specifically for this occasion. My reflection showed a woman I barely recognized. Not because I looked different, exactly, but because I looked alive in a way I hadn't seen in years. My eyes sparkled with anticipation, my cheeks were flushed with excitement, and my smile seemed to come from somewhere deep inside. Tonight was Michael's school's annual spring gala, a fundraising event for the arts program, and he had asked me to be his date. Not his secret companion or his hidden girlfriend, but his official, public, photographed for the school newsletter date. The thought should have made me nervous, but instead it filled me with pride. Mom, you look absolutely radiant, Rebecca said from the doorway, and I turned to see her holding a jewelry box. I brought something for you. Over the past months, Rebecca had slowly integrated herself back into our lives, not as the controlling presence she'd once been, but as a supportive daughter who was learning to celebrate her mother's choices. The change hadn't happened overnight. There had been awkward dinners and forced conversations, and moments when old patterns tried to reassert themselves. But therapy had given Rebecca tools for recognizing her controlling impulses, and love had given all of us the motivation to keep trying. What's this? I asked as she handed me the box. Inside was a delicate silver necklace with a pendant shaped like a butterfly, something I'd admired in a jewelry store window months ago, but had decided was too young for me. That woman who worried about age-appropriate jewelry seemed like a stranger now. I saw you looking at it that day we went shopping downtown, Rebecca said as she fastened the clasp behind my neck. You said it was beautiful but not practical for someone your age. I thought tonight might be the perfect time to prove that woman wrong. The necklace caught the light as I moved, sending tiny sparkles across the mirror. It was perfect, delicate enough to be elegant, bold enough to make a statement. Thank you, I said, squeezing Rebecca's hand. For this and for everything else. Thank you for teaching me what real courage looks like, she replied. I'm still learning, but watching you and Michael, it's given me hope that I might find that kind of happiness someday too. Rebecca had started dating someone herself, a pediatric nurse named David, who shared her dry sense of humor and her passion for hiking. More importantly, she'd started approaching relationships differently, focusing on connection rather than control, on partnership rather than performance. She credited our family crisis, as she jokingly called it, with forcing her to examine patterns she might have repeated for years. When Michael arrived to pick me up, he stopped short in my doorway, his eyes wide with appreciation. Patricia Coleman, he said slowly, you are absolutely breathtaking. He looked pretty spectacular himself in a charcoal suit with a bow tie that matched my dress. A coordination we'd planned together like the established couple we'd become. At 60 and 58, we moved through the world with the easy confidence of people who'd found their match. The gala was held in the restored ballroom of the historic Neville Public Museum, with its soaring ceilings and crystal chandeliers creating an atmosphere of old-world elegance. As we walked in together, I felt eyes turning toward us, but instead of the self-consciousness I might have expected, I felt only pride. This was my man, and I was his woman, and we had nothing to hide or apologize for. Mr. Harrison, called out a voice, and a teenage girl in a glittering blue dress approached us with a wide smile. I can't believe you actually know how to dress up. Michael laughed and introduced me to Sarah, one of his AP history students who was working at the event as part of her community service requirement. "Sarah, I'd like you to meet my girlfriend Patricia." The word girlfriend still gave me a little thrill, even after all these months. Sarah's eyes lit up with curiosity and approval. "Oh my gosh, you're so pretty," she said with the wonderful lack of filter that teenagers possess. "Mr. Harrison talks about you all the time. He's like, completely smitten." "Sarah," Michael said, his cheeks reddening slightly. "What? You do? You're always quoting something Patricia said or telling us about some restaurant you went to together. It's actually really sweet. Most of our teachers are either totally boring or completely bitter about love." As Sarah bounced away to attend to her duties, Michael and I looked at each other and burst into laughter. "Completely smitten?" I teased. "Utterly and hopelessly," he confirmed, spinning me onto the dance floor as the band began playing "The Way You Look Tonight." We danced for hours that night, sometimes to slow, romantic songs that let us hold each other close, sometimes to upbeat numbers that made us laugh as we attempted moves we hadn't tried since our youth. Other couples smiled at us approvingly, not with the condescending, "how cute" expressions I'd feared, but with genuine warmth for two people obviously in love. "You know what I realized tonight?" I said as we swayed to a particularly beautiful rendition of "At Last." "What's that?" I spent so many years thinking that love was something that happened to young people, something I'd had my turn at and shouldn't expect again. But this feels nothing like what I had before. It's deeper, more intentional, more joyful. It's like the difference between a candle and a bonfire. Michael pulled back to look at me, his expression serious and tender. "Patricia, there's something I've been wanting to talk to you about." My heart skipped, not with anxiety but with excitement. Over the past month, I'd caught Michael looking at jewelry store windows, and our conversations had increasingly turned toward the future in ways that felt significant and permanent. "Here?" I asked, glancing around the crowded ballroom. "Why not here?" he said, his smile growing wider. "We met at a public market, had our first fight in a parking lot, and declared our love over Thai leftovers. Nothing about our relationship has been conventional." Before I could respond, Michael was kneeling on the dance floor, pulling a small velvet box from his jacket pocket. The conversations around us quieted, as people began to notice what was happening. "Patricia Coleman," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet room. "You have made me believe in second chances, in new beginnings, in the possibility that the best parts of life might still be ahead of us. Will you marry me?" The ring was perfect, a classic solitaire that caught the light from the chandeliers and sent rainbows dancing across the floor. But more perfect was the expression on Michael's face, the hope and love and absolute certainty I saw there. "Yes," I said, not caring that my voice cracked with emotion or that tears were streaming down my face. "Yes, absolutely yes." The ballroom erupted in applause as Michael slipped the ring onto my finger and stood to kiss me. As we were surrounded by congratulations from strangers who had witnessed our moment, I felt overwhelmed by the generosity of the universe that had given me this second act, this unexpected love, this chance to be fully myself. Later that night, as we sat on my porch swing sharing a bottle of champagne and watching the stars, I thought about the journey that had brought us here. From Rebecca's dismissive comment about my age to this moment of pure joy, it had been less than a year, but it felt like a lifetime of growth and discovery. "Do you think Robert would approve?" I asked, a question that had been on my mind as our relationship grew more serious. Michael considered this carefully, as he did all important questions. "I think Robert would want you to be happy," he said finally. "I think he'd be grateful that someone loves you enough to encourage your dreams, support your independence, and treat you like the remarkable woman you are." "And Rebecca?" "Rebecca is planning our engagement party," Michael said with a laugh. "I think she's more excited about this wedding than we are." It was true. Rebecca had thrown herself into celebrating our engagement with the same intensity she brought to everything else in her life. She'd already started researching venues and making guest lists and offering to handle details we hadn't even thought of yet. But more importantly, she'd embraced our love story as proof that it was never too late to rewrite your life. "You know what the best part of all this is?" I said, curling closer to Michael on the swing. "What's that?" "I'm not trying to recapture my youth or prove anything to anyone. I'm just living my life, loving someone who loves me back, and being exactly who I am at this moment. 58-year-old me, with my laugh lines and my silver hair and my confidence earned through decades of experience. And I love every bit of that 58-year-old you, Michael said, kissing the top of my head. Especially the part that was brave enough to tell her daughter that romance doesn't have an expiration date. As we sat there planning our future together, a small ceremony in my garden, a honeymoon trip to Ireland to explore Michael's genealogy, the possibility of selling both our places and buying something new together. I marveled at how different my life looked now from what I'd imagined just 1 year ago. I'd thought my story was ending when Robert died, that I was settling into the final, quiet chapter of a life well lived. Instead, I'd discovered that some stories don't end. They just begin new volumes. This was my second book, and I was writing it with someone who appreciated both the heroine I had always been and the woman I was still becoming. At 58, I was falling in love, planning a wedding, and learning that the heart doesn't retire just because the body ages. I was living proof that it's never too late to choose joy, to take risks, to scandalously and beautifully live your truth. And if that made me too old for romance in some people's minds, well, that was their loss. Because I was having the time of my life. Meter pricasa epeo. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.